Hi, this is Kim McAllister, and today we're going to talk about disaster, the community and the public nurse's role. When a disaster happens, this is something that both community and public health nurses can respond to very effectively. The key to participating in disaster response and the other areas of disaster that we'll talk about, the other stages, is to become involved with your local and state agencies and national agencies before the disaster happens. If this is something that you're interested in learning more about, just let me know, because this is a big area of my practice. I've done some of the very first nursing research on disaster and continue to participate in various state, local, and national response agencies. So disasters happen everywhere. It's not a matter of if a disaster is going to happen. It's a matter of when. We've seen so many hurricanes, floods, wildfires, tornadoes, big storms, other things that have happened. We have war going on in portions of the world. All of these things are, work to really stress our response agencies, our relief agencies, and our preparation agencies. It's becoming more and more important that we become very informed about disaster and work to educate people to prevent disaster where we can, and also to educate people to prepare and how to fully prepare. And we learn every time we have a disaster, we learn more about what to do and how to respond, and we learn more about ourselves as responders and what other supplies, what other arrangements and agreements need to be made. We do something called a hot wash after a disaster, where everyone who is involved sits around and talks about what happened, the things that worked, the things that didn't work, and then we continually work to improve the process and find ways to be ready for the particular problem or lack of resource that we experienced each time. In this way, every time we respond, our response gets better, it gets faster, and it gets more effective. So first, you need to understand what a disaster is. And a disaster is an event that causes destruction, and it may or may cause loss of life and damage of property, but there is destruction. It impacts the community or the population to the extent that it cannot be relieved or recovered without outside assistance. That assistance may be first responders, it may be disaster relief, it may be search and rescue, cash, resources, food, water, clothing, medical care, and so on. So the key to remembering what a disaster is that it does require help from outside agencies in order to relieve the situation. So disasters can be categorized as natural disasters and man-made. Natural disasters happen without any direct impact from other people. We're very familiar with hurricanes. I know some of you in the class were personally impacted, and we're all glad that you're okay. So you have been through this recently personally and understand why it's so important to be prepared and the impact that it can have on the population. And as far as the TV goes, we see the disaster over and over again on all the different news channels on TV, and we stir up a lot of help and support, but eventually that support falls off and the community has to continue to recover. And so we need to be aware that a disaster happens, and then the recovery and the response, all of that can take a long time, and people are usually changed in some way, and communities are changed in ways that are never fully repairable. So they also include lightning-induced fires. This does not include fires started by careless campers or by people throwing something out the window and it catches on fire. A lightning-induced fire is a natural disaster when lightning strikes and it ignites the surrounding tinder. Hail, we had over $20,000 worth of damage done to our home last year in the big hailstorms, and everyone in our neighborhood had got a new roof, and some people are still having repairs to their homes that have not been finished. Droughts, floods, earthquakes, tsunamis, these are all examples of natural disasters. Also mudslides, rock slides, sinkholes, that can all cause disasters. A human-made disaster is caused by people. That includes warfare. We're all very familiar with the fact that wars have been going on so long and been so devastating that people can no longer live in their own country or their community, and they're having to leave. We have transportation accidents. A lot of times in the winter, there'll be a multi-car accident that can be a disaster. Think about a train derailment. There can be a train derailment that can be a passenger train that can result in a lot of harm, injury, and death to people. There can also be accidents where the train is carrying toxic chemicals or a large truck is carrying toxic chemicals. The truck crashes and releases that into the atmosphere. Some examples of that are chlorine, and then people have to be evacuated. We can have explosions. There was the big explosion in West Texas. We can have things like the nuclear accidents that have happened in various places in the world. We can have a release of toxic chemicals that can poison the groundwater and poison people or can kill off wildlife. Also, pollution can cause a disaster. So these are some examples. There are certainly more, but we'll move on. The level of the response is determined by how much it costs to deal with the disaster. This is not something you need to know for the exam, but just understand when you hear that there was a level 2 disaster, a level 5 disaster, this is what it means. It has to do with how much it costs. And this is, the amount can be estimated and it can be higher and lower. A lot of times the final cost isn't fully tallied until maybe even several years after the event. We have four stages of disaster involvement. The first stage is mitigation, and mitigation is something that is done to help to minimize the impact of a future disaster. Sometimes mitigation can prevent it. An example of mitigation in San Antonio, you may have heard that the Riverwalk area in downtown San Antonio flooded a number of years ago, very severely, and they built a series of floodgates to block the San Antonio River so that it doesn't flood that area and all of the businesses again. The Galveston hurricane many, many years ago, after that happened, they built a big seawall. That would be an example of mitigation. So next is disaster preparedness, and this is where people and agencies take steps to have supplies and resources, agreements, volunteers, places for response. Areas are designated shelters, potential shelters. Different agreements are struck with companies. You may have noticed in the recent hurricanes, HEB is a big responder. They send trucks with supplies, with bottled water and food and other necessities into areas before the disaster hits so that they can provide relief to people after the disaster comes in. We have different agreements in Texas for people that are on dialysis, people that are signed up at dialysis centers. There is some tracking that's done so that we know how many people are going to a particular dialysis center, and people that evacuate to evacuation shelters and evacuation zones. They have plans made so that people can get dialysis, so they have alternate schedules planned and so forth. This is one of the big issues that we have. As you know, with dialysis, people who need dialysis, if they can't get that during a disaster, then they can die very quickly. So we had to make arrangements for that. We have all sorts of arrangements for hospital beds and hospital equipment and supplies and personnel to staff the medical shelters all across the state. All of these things took a lot of time and work to put together, and we have state, local, and county emergency management offices throughout Texas. We'll talk about those in a little while, but they all work together on a regular basis and meet together and have all of these memorandums of agreement that are set up so that all of this just starts falling into place when a disaster is coming. Preparedness also includes your personal preparedness. What are you going to do to be prepared for yourself, your family or friends, other people who are living near you or with you, people that depend on you? You have to be prepared personally. You also have to be prepared professionally, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. Then there's the actual response stage of the disaster. This is what is done when the disaster is underway, and all the different people and organizations of first responders and volunteer organizations, shelters, all of these things start gearing up and preparing for a disaster. And I say gearing up if we know something's coming. Like a hurricane, we generally know 5 days out that one is approaching Texas. And so that's about when the shelters will stand up in Texas. If it's something that happens suddenly, like a tornado or a hail storm or some type of explosion, then there's no preceding period. It all just has to gear up and happen as fast as it can. And this is why we engage in a lot of exercises, which is part of preparedness. We do a lot of different emergency drills and so forth to get ready. Be sure that whenever there's a disaster drill where you work, that you fully participate, because whatever you practice is what you do, and in practicing and participating, you'll help to save lives. And then there's the recovery stage, and this is probably one of the really tough parts when you go in and assist and see devastation, or you work with people who have lost everything, who have lost loved ones, who have been injured, and they are just in such a state of distress. And the response of the people can be very varied. They can be very frightened and very stressed and upset. They may be relieved that they're okay, but then they're worried about other family and friends. And they go through the grief process of going through shock and disbelief and then anger, and working their way through that process during the recovery time. So these are the basic stages of disaster involvement. Your personal preparedness begins with preparation. As I stated earlier, your job may require that you commit to a disaster and respond in a particular way. Understand that as a nurse, you can also be the victim. You could be in a hospital and the disaster happened at the hospital, or you could be affected at your home or anywhere where you are. And so you may become a victim rather than becoming a responder. That can be very difficult for nurses because we want to be the ones in there helping and responding. Understand that community nurses play a very key role in helping to educate the public about preparedness. And you as a nurse, whether you choose to work in the community or the hospital, are going to learn some things to teach your patients and people that you come in contact with. And so I want you to join me in helping to prepare and educate the people where you work about disaster so that everyone knows that they need to have a plan and how to do it. And we'll do that in just a little bit. So people need to be educated that they need their personal medical records. Most everyone goes to a physician or provider who has a health portal. Those portals were required under the Acute Care Act, by the way, if you don't know that. But they can pull off a copy of their last visit. People should have a copy of their last note from their doctor or provider. This is important because when people come to the medical shelters, and I've worked in a great many of them, they're very traumatized. They may be injured. They may be unconscious. They may be separated from their loved ones, and they may have a complex medical history, but they can't remember. So when people are very frightened or scared, it's difficult to remember. They don't remember what their health condition is, who their doctor is, what medications they were on, much less bring them. We've had patients pulled directly off roofs who had none of their insulin or their diabetes testing supplies, or patients with stomas that had no wafers or bags. So it's very risky for a provider to prescribe for someone when they don't know their health history, their allergies, and so forth, and they don't know what medications that they're on. So it's important for patients to make a copy of their record and put that in their disaster kit. It's important to have just general supplies, food, water, and so on. It's good to have flashlights and batteries. You want to discourage people from using candles because if there's natural gas in the area, it can cause an explosion. Candles are also really good at setting the house on fire. So batteries or battery-operated lights or solar lanterns, those are really great. Duct tape is always wonderful. You can use it to tape over a window or to do all sorts of things with. It's important that during a time of disaster, that patients not throw away medications that are immediately expired. It may take time to get medication back into the area, and so they need to not just automatically throw things away because they're expired. They do need a list of their medications, again, so providers can prescribe for them and so that they can get a better understanding of what kind of health illness they have. Also, if they have diabetes or some other type of medical device that they use, it's important to have that device and strips and other things that they need to operate the device. Everyone should have an emergency contact. There should be someone that they should contact so that they know that they're okay or they know that they're in a disaster. For me, we contact my sister. She lives in another state. If there's some kind of disaster coming or something happened, we call her and let her know we're okay, and then she can communicate that to the rest of the family. It's really helpful if people have someone that they can contact like that so that other family and other friends don't have to worry. Some ways to personally prepare if you're not sure how to do that is you can go to FEMA, and this is ready.gov. And this has a whole list of how to get a plan together. It talks about, gives definitions of emergency alerts and warnings, has a shelter plan, know where you're going to shelter before the disaster happens, know how safe your home is for whatever particular thing that you are sheltering from. If it's something that's going to cause you to evacuate, already know what your evacuation route is going to be, unless it's some off-the-wall kind of thing. And then what is your family household communication plan? How are you going to let other people know if you're okay? Where are you all going to meet? You should have a place set where if something happens to your home or your business, that we're all going to meet here. We're going to meet 2 doors down at the neighbor's house under their oak tree, or we're going to meet at the 7-Eleven down the street. Whatever that plan is, you need to make it. So then you need to look at what your specific needs are for your household. Look at the different ages of your household. If you have an infant, you're going to need formula, bottles, diapers, wipes. If you have someone who's disabled, you want to be sure that you have sufficient supplies or additional assistive devices if needed. If you have special dietary needs, be sure that you have food in your supplies that are appropriate for the dietary needs. And speaking about food, you want to be sure that you have food that can be prepared and stored without electricity. So that generally is going to mean canned food or preserved food. So be sure that you have that. If you have a pet, you need to have a disaster plan for your pet. So make your pet a disaster kit. Put some food in it, a water bottle, your dog's vaccination records. Your dog may have to be sheltered in a pet shelter, and you need to have those vaccination records with you. Also, if you have school-age children, they need to have something to keep them entertained and some kind of activities to help them deal with the stress. So these are just some basic things to think about with different ages. This has an emergency plan for parents, and then this has a whole list of different things that you can click on and print. This is the family emergency communication plan, and this has the emergency contacts on this one. This has a video on how to make a plan, which is really great.
Being prepared is a part of who you are, but it's especially important in the case of a disaster. It's up to everyone to make a plan about possible emergencies in your area and the best responses for your personal circumstances. There's no one more capable of planning for your situation than you. Be informed, make a plan, build a kit, get involved. Visit ready.gov/myplan.
Okay, do what they say. And this has how to protect valuables and so forth. So this has a lot of neat stuff. And this is a sample emergency plan. And you can see it has a checklist. And you can go through all of these. FEMA wants you to have enough food and water for 3 days. For water, you need 1 gallon of water per person per day. My recommendation is that you have a minimum of 7 days. Just because if it's a major disaster or if there are disasters happening in multiple places, the response could be delayed and it could be longer. So this also has some other information on people with disabilities, military, pets, seniors, and so on. And they even have one Ready Campus on how to prepare if you're living in college. The Red Cross also has some really good information, and so does Prepare.org. I'm not going to look at all of these. It's in the middle. It was working a minute ago. Okay. I'll check that link and find it. The Red Cross one I know is working. So these are just some frequently asked questions about disaster. Won't FEMA take care of me? FEMA will arrive when FEMA can, but as I said, if there are multiple disasters going on at once, they may not be able to respond right away. And the Red Cross, again, will respond as soon as they can. If the area is not safe, then they're not going to be there. So, they won't be allowed in. So it's very important to be prepared to take care of yourself for a while. You can't wait until the disaster is upon you to go get supplies. We have very little warehousing anymore. And in the case of a disaster, a grocery store has enough food for one day. That means if you are in an area where an evacuation comes, then everything in the store may be cleared out. So don't wait until the disaster comes or it's almost upon you. Get your stuff ready and have stuff available. Understand what your disaster plans for your workplace and your community are. To be professionally prepared, you need to have a copy of your license. So take a screenshot of your nursing license and print that off. Also, any certifications that you have, be sure you have hard copies of the certificate that you get from that. You need your driver's license. If you want to participate with the Red Cross, you have to do the Red Cross disaster training. So complete that course and have your documentation of that. And this list on Smith and Maurer, we're not using that book, so don't do that. Community preparedness may include participating in disaster drills, also know what your community preparedness is. Look at the past disasters that have come and what kind of impact they've had on your healthcare system so that you have kind of an idea of what to expect. Know what types of disasters are likely to hit your area. You can look on in your area, you can pull up on Google the floodplain for your particular community and see if you're living in the floodplain. And if you are, then you would need to prepare for floods. If you're thinking about buying a house, I strongly recommend you look up that floodplain information before you buy it so that you don't buy a house that's in the floodplain. Know the role of your agency. Know where you work and what they're going to do in a disaster. It's important to encourage communication between all agencies. The reason I mention that is there are no acronyms in disaster response because we respond with multiple agencies and different types of healthcare professionals, and we all have our own jargon. So when you're responding in a disaster and you're working with people who are not nurses, it's important to remember not to use the nursing jargon because some of our jargon is not the same as their jargon, and people get confused. Be sure you know what agencies ensure disaster preparedness in your area. When I wrote this, I was living in San Antonio. I'm in Kerrville now, but it's important to know the different agencies. It's your job as a community nurse to educate the community. So whenever you are with a patient, when you have a patient come in and talk with you, unless you're in the operating room, ask your patient, do you have any preparation for a disaster? And you can show them the ready.gov website and you can tell them have some food and water for about a week, and be sure you get a current copy of your note from your doctor and have a medication list. It's very important to get people prepared. Be involved in the formation of the disaster plan wherever you work so that you can tell them, hey, this is not going to work for nursing. For example, I was on a committee about nursing home evacuations, and the first responders assumed that there would be plenty of wheelchairs for everyone at the nursing home, and I had to explain that if the nursing home's on fire or if there's something goes wrong, they may not necessarily have a wheelchair for everyone. And some of the people who are ambulatory may suddenly need a wheelchair, so you need to be sure to bring those with you when you're going to evacuate nursing homes, which they did. Always be alert for potential disasters and report them right away. And be aware of your available resources. And you can only do that by finding out what they are. If you're not involved in disaster at your agency, then get your agency involved because everyone needs to play a part. So this is just a review. You can think of what different types of these disasters are natural disasters, and another review about what people should have. I didn't mention this earlier, but it's very important to have cash. If you know a disaster is coming, and really it's just good to have a little bit of cash on hand anyway, because if you lose electricity, the ATMs are not going to work. Be sure you keep your car filled up, because gas pumps are not going to work. You want proof of your ID. Rechargeable batteries are great to have. Let's talk about what the different government agencies do. FEMA is our Federal Emergency Management Agency. What they do is pretty complex. This has some information on all that they do. You're not going to be tested on any of these specifics. This is resource information for you. This tells you how to volunteer, different things that you can donate for, different information on disaster, fact sheets, which are really good, all sorts of additional information. Here's protecting your home, protecting your community, and you can click on these things and get information. Here's your hazard mitigation planning, hazard mitigation assistance, all kinds of information. Find this out for your community, and you could even end up making this your community teaching project, and so that would be a great resource. The Department of Homeland Security is also very involved in disaster response, and this gives you information about that and what they do. The Center for Disease Control and Preparedness also is very involved in emergency, and this tells you how to shelter in place. That means stay where you are in an emergency. They have information for specific groups, how to cope with disaster or traumatic event, and other information. And this has like a list of recent outbreaks and incidents. You can see what has been going on and where. Your state, if you live in Texas, this has a lot of really great information on preparing Texas. There's all kinds of training and information. Here's a whole training catalog of things that you can find out. Different courses. Some courses are available online that you can take. Some are available at different locations. This tells you they have different exercise notifications. If you have the credentials to do so, you can log in. The mutual aid agreements, these are the partnerships that I talked about that we have ready for response. If organizations want to get involved, they can contact the Department of Public Safety and find out how to do that. This has all kinds of information about preparedness. It has a video library that you can also look at, so lots of information there. This gives you all the information for your local emergency management. So wherever you are in cities and counties, they're all on here. And your Citizens Corps and so forth. Really cool stuff. The National Guard, if there's a threat here in Texas, if there's a disaster, they respond. There's an article here that you can read. Again, these slides will be posted. And this talks about things that the Guard did to help, and you can learn more about what they do. First responders. We think about first responders always rescuing us. Remember that they all have to be safe and be taken care of. And so part of our job as community nurses is making sure that they have the resources that they need, and we may even be involved in helping provide resources for them and protecting them and helping them if they're injured. So the effect of disaster on a community depends on what kind of disaster it was and where it happened and what happened and how much time we had to prepare. Something like a hurricane, we have time to prepare, evacuate, get resources, establish shelters. The devastation can be really bad, but we have the opportunity to save a lot of lives. When there's a situation like the explosion in West Texas, that happens suddenly without warning, and so all we can do is respond to that. So it makes a big difference in how things go. Disasters can disrupt all of the regular services. There may not be power, and after power goes out, the water can go out because the electric pumps that pump the water for the city service may go out. So it's always important to fill up on water and have plenty of water on hand beforehand. The healthcare system can be overwhelmed. Think about how busy it can get in the emergency room when you have a few people come in every so many minutes. In a major disaster, you may have people lined up for more than a mile, and it can be really bad. We run out of supplies because, again, we don't warehouse, and so it can be really bad when you've run out of supplies and people need those, and they need healthcare supplies and medical supplies. Communication can be disrupted. The cell towers can be destroyed. Landlines can be out, so communication can be really bad. There can be violence and looting. Sometimes people will take advantage of something like this to break into businesses and steal things and commit other types of violent acts. People get under tremendous stress when you lose everything you have or other people are injured. It's very upsetting. You also can lose everything that you own. Understand that the way people respond to disaster can depend on culture, age, health status, their support system, and their ability to deal with stress. Children and the very young may not understand what's going on. And from research we've done in the past, when they show a disastrous event over and over and over again on TV, many children think the same thing's happening over and over again, and that's very upsetting. Also, people who are very old may have very few people to rely on, and they can be very frightened, and they may not understand as well. People who have chronic illnesses, this can be devastating, and people can die because they can't get the things that they need. People can be going through post-traumatic stress. They may not be able to function because of the stress and the manifestations of PTSD. Most people will get to the point where they're angry and blaming. They may blame themselves or other people, and they have to have a way to deal with the anger. Again, the very young, the very old, and those who are impoverished are the most vulnerable. Underdeveloped countries are trying to live from day to day and may not have any sort of infrastructure at all for handling a disaster. We saw that with Haiti and some of the other places that have just witnessed terrible disaster. They have no resources or people to help, and they rely entirely on outside agencies for help. So you need to think about what you would do as a community nurse in a disaster. One of the things that you may be asked to do is triage, and we have to, instead of looking at saving everybody, we have to focus our time and our resources on saving the people who are savable. People that have life-threatening injuries but are estimated to live are our first priority. People who have life-threatening injuries and the likelihood of not living are simply not treated. They may be given something to make them comfortable, but the resources will not be expended on them. Your second priority would be people whose illnesses or injuries are not immediately life-threatening and they can wait about an hour or so for treatment. And the people that have injuries that are not immediately complicated and can wait for several hours, these will be our last priority. They're kind of what we call the walking wounded. And this just shows a schematic. If you're walking and you're wounded, you're considered minor and you're going to be last on the list. If you have died, then we're not going to treat you. If we feel like you're about to die, then we're not going to treat you. And then we go through this schematic to determine who's immediate and who can be delayed. And understand, this sounds cold and it's very difficult for families. It's also very, very difficult for the people doing the triage to do. This is not an easy decision to make. So the workers can be distressed and the victims can be distressed. And so one of the things that we do in the shelters is kind of evaluate people on an ongoing basis. People will start to shake a little bit, maybe have a little tremor, have nausea, vomiting. Their stomach is so distressed they can't eat and they feel nauseated. They may vomit a lot. They may begin to have some memory issues, trouble not concentrating, memory problems, just not acting like themselves. These are people that need a break. People may become irritable, have a headache. They may kind of have an explosive anger where they lash out at other coworkers, and they need a chance to stop and regroup. So in order to deal with that stress when you're working in a disaster, you need to make sure that the workers have small, frequent meals, that people do get the opportunity to have a break, walk around outside if it's safe to do so, just have a moment to get away from what they're doing. Have some sleep, have a break, maybe sit around and talk with other people, talk about how they're feeling, have like some downtime. Some medical shelters and other shelters will have counselors or psychiatrists or psychologists available that can help and talk with people, or social workers, and it's important to do that, kind of blow off some steam. You need to stay in touch with your own family. Also, journaling can help. Writing about how you feel just kind of helps to download those feelings from your brain, put them down on paper. Also, you need to encourage each other and lift each other up. Understand that recovery is an enormous effort, and there are continual new problems that come up during recovery. Those have to be evaluated, assessed, and dealt with. The very cleanup effort may cause problems. There may be mold, there may be cholera, there may be other things that happen, injuries to people who are cleaning up. They may find some type of toxic issue where certain waste that were released that shouldn't have been because of the disaster. Oftentimes the water becomes unusable because the treatment plants will overflow or backflow and become mixed with the clean water. So all of this is going to require case management and follow-up. And remember that you as the community nurse cannot do all this by yourself. Everyone has an individual responsibility to be prepared, and we all have to work together. We cannot accomplish this. This is not something nursing can fix by itself. And so we have to work with our other agencies and let them help us. Understand that in a disaster response, biological agents could also be a cause. They could be released as an accident or as an act of terror. You're not going to be tested on the different categories of agents. I've simply listed these here for your information. And category A agents are things that can be released and easily transmitted from person to person. They have very high mortality rates and have the potential to be a major public health threat. An example of this could be somebody who infects themselves with smallpox. Yes, it's been eradicated, but there is smallpox in the lab, and some smallpox has been unaccounted for when the Soviet Union broke up. some of that smallpox was released. But we were told it was destroyed, but that destruction was not witnessed. So there's some question about where that is. It could easily be some other type of agent. But getting back to smallpox, someone could infect themselves with it, get on an airplane, go to one of the major airports, and infect people from all over the place. And so this is why we have to be vigilant about looking for threats. So these are some examples of your Category A agents. It includes anthrax as well as smallpox. If you work in an emergency room, it's a really good idea to know the signs and symptoms of these diseases. That way, if somebody shows up with it, you can immediately contact public health and isolate that person and minimize the impact on other people that come in. Category B agents are moderately easy to disseminate and have more moderate rates of mortality and morbidity. So it's a little bit easier to catch because it's a little slower. And here's a list of all of those. Your Category C, these are agents that could be emerging pathogens that could be engineered for mass dissemination. So it's important to know what these are. It could be an emerging disease such as Nipah virus or the hantavirus. So as far as bioterrorism, you're going to do the same thing as you would do for any other type of disaster. Remember what your levels of preparedness are. Think about how you can prepare personally and professionally. How can the community prepare? How can you help the community prepare? Become as educated as possible about all potential threats. You can, if you get some of your continuing education credits, take some disaster continuing education credit and learn more about that. You can take online courses from the Department of Health and Safety, and you can also take courses from FEMA. There are other agencies out there that offer free courses that will help educate you. Understand how to protect yourself from personal threats. Know your PPE and how to use it. Make sure that it fits and seals when it's supposed to. And the level of protection that you need is going to depend on where and how you respond. You need to be ready to act when something happens. Know your resources, know who to call, know where everything is, know what your role is, know where you're going to respond, and know how to protect yourself. Please take care of yourself. Whenever I talk about disaster, I always talk about something that happened to a nurse when the federal building was destroyed in Oklahoma City. One of the first people to arrive on scene was a nurse, a registered nurse, and she began digging through the rubble, trying to help people and find people. And the scene was not secure, and so some of the rubble collapsed on her and she was killed. So please, when you arrive at a scene, make sure that it's secured before you begin to act. Don't put yourself in danger. You're too valuable a resource. So please be very careful. Be careful out there.